calm flight took a shocking turn when a flight attendant accused a couple of wrongdoing and called security. But just minutes later, the tables turned in a way no one saw coming, leaving the entire cabin speechless. Curiosity ignited as viewers wondered what really happened during those 610 minutes. Before we start the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. In the heart of first class, a flight attendant became the epicenter of a swiftly growing disturbance. As passengers began to settle into their seats, murmurs transformed into a cascade of uneasy whispers, and all eyes were drawn to the emerging scene. The once calm chatter was abruptly silenced by the tension, each person sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Amid this charged atmosphere, the poised couple, Orion and Serafina, exuded an air of quiet elegance. Their calm, almost enigmatic demeanor only deepened the mystery, as the flight attendant's stern presence escalated the drama with every assertive gesture. A couple, Orion and Serafina, both dressed with effortless sophistication, sat quietly as the flight attendant loomed over them, her expression a mix of authority and impatience. Orion, a tech entrepreneur, and Serafina, a well-known lawyer, had boarded the flight with their usual calm and confidence. Anticipation of a serene weekend getaway had lifted their spirits as they escaped the relentless pace of their demanding careers. Every detail of their trip, from the meticulously planned first-class booking to the smooth scan at the gate, had promised a brief retreat into luxury. Yet, as they settled into the plush seats, the tranquility they craved began to unravel into an unforeseen ordeal. At that precise moment, Araminta, a flight attendant exuding strict professionalism, clutched her notebook with intent focus. Her eyes zeroed in on the couple, and although her tone was controlled, it carried an unmistakable edge. "I'll need to see your tickets again," she said, her voice rising just enough to capture the attention of nearby passengers. Orion, maintaining his unflappable demeanor, slid his boarding pass over with deliberate calm, his gaze steady and perceptive. Sitting closely beside him, Serafina offered hers with equal precision, her hands betraying none of the inner worry as murmurs swirled around them. Araminta's scrutiny deepened as she flipped the tickets over, meticulously rechecking every detail before returning them with a curt nod. "I'll be back," she said, and with brisk steps, she disappeared toward the galley, leaving an unsettling silence in her wake. A glance exchanged between Serafina and Orion spoke volumes. In a soft, anxious murmur, Serafina confided, "This doesn't feel right." Orion's response was measured and resolute. "Let's just stay calm. We've done nothing wrong." Yet, beneath their composed exteriors, an undercurrent of tension began to ripple through the cabin. Curiosity transformed into whispered speculations as passengers leaned in. A gentleman seated nearby, his concern evident in his cautious tone, asked, "Everything okay?" Orion managed a small nod and a brief, "It's fine," though the lingering doubt in the man's expression hinted that not everyone was convinced. As minutes passed, Araminta returned, this time with an air of finality. She leaned slightly toward the couple, her tone colder now. "I'm going to need you both to come with me. There seems to be an issue with your seating," she said. Serafina's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained composed. "Our tickets are for these seats," she said firmly. "There shouldn't be any issue." Araminta straightened her face, hardening. "We can sort it out in the galley," she said, gesturing toward the back of the plane. The murmurs around them grew louder, but Orion stood with deliberate calm, and Serafina followed, her chin raised slightly as she picked up her bag. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly as they walked, passengers turning their heads to watch them pass. Araminta led them to the narrow space near the galley and folded her arms. "There's been a mistake," she said flatly. "These seats aren't yours." Serafina tilted her head, her voice calm but firm. "Our tickets were scanned and confirmed at the gate. There's no mistake." Araminta didn't falter. "I'm going to have to involve security if you don't cooperate," she said. Orion glanced at Serafia, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he pulled his phone from his pocket, holding it firmly. "Before you do that," he said quietly, "you should make sure you know what you're doing." Araminta's frown deepened, but her gaze wavered slightly. Back in the first-class cabin, the tension was palpable. Passengers whispered to one another, glancing toward the galley where the couple had disappeared. The man who had spoken earlier crossed his arms, his face set in a deep frown. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered to himself. Meanwhile, Araminta's tone grew sharper as she repeated her demand, but Serafina stood her ground, her voice steady. "I think it's time we called someone who can help clarify this situation," she said, pulling her phone from her bag. Orion watched her with a small nod, his expression calm but focused. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers exchanged worried glances. Some leaned into the aisles to catch a glimpse of what was happening near the galley. Araminta's frustration became more evident with each passing moment. "Ma'am, I've already explained the issue," she said firmly, though her voice carried a hint of nervousness. Serafina, however, remained composed, dialing a number on her phone with quiet determination. Orion stood slightly behind her, his phone now recording the interaction. "This is unacceptable," he said. His tone, calm but resolute, declared, "We're not going to be moved unless you provide a valid reason." Araminta stiffened her posture, rigid. "Sir, I don't have to explain myself further," she snapped. "If you refuse to comply, I'll call security." Serafina pressed the phone to her ear and waited a moment before speaking. "Hello?" she said, her tone professional but unmistakably firm. "I'm on flight 387, first class. My husband and I are being told we cannot remain in our seats despite holding valid tickets. Could you assist us with this matter?" Orion caught a subtle shift in Araminta's expression as Serafia spoke. Confusion, perhaps even doubt. Araminta interrupted sharply, "Who are you calling? I told you this is a security matter." Serafia ignored her, calmly continuing, "Yes, we're still on the plane. I'll send you a quick text with the details." She ended the call, her movements deliberate and unhurried, and began typing on her phone. Araminta's patience was clearly wearing thin. "This isn't going to change anything," she said, her tone now laced with irritation. Meanwhile, back in the first-class cabin, a man in a suit leaned over to a flight attendant named Callista, who had been quietly observing the situation. "This doesn't seem right," he said under his breath. Callista nodded slightly, but didn't respond, her eyes flickering toward the galley as she seemed hesitant, as though debating whether to intervene. Moments later, Araminta turned abruptly and walked toward the phone mounted near the galley wall. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening as Araminta made the call. She had threatened, "This is Araminta first-class cabin. I need security at gate 12 immediately," she said into the phone, her voice brisk. "We have 2 passengers refusing to comply." Serafina and Orion exchanged a glance. Serafina's expression didn't change, but Orion raised an eyebrow slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching as though he were holding back a reaction. Araminta hung up and turned back to them, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "They'll be here shortly," she said. "I suggest you cooperate before this escalates further." But Serafia remained calm, slipping her phone back into her bag. "Wait," she said simply, her tone neutral. Her response seemed to settle Araminta, who hesitated for a brief moment before walking back into the first-class cabin, likely to update her colleagues in her absence. Orion finally broke the silence. "What did they say?" he asked Serafina. She looked at him, her expression steady. "They're working on it," she said quietly. "Let's just give it a few more minutes." Orion nodded, leaning against the galley wall as the sound of approaching footsteps from the cabin signaled Araminta's return. Araminta returned to the galley, her face set in a mask of forced confidence. Behind her, the hum of the plane grew quieter as passengers watched the unfolding drama with increasing interest. Callista trailed a few steps behind Araminta, her expression a mix of concern and hesitation. "Security is on the way," Araminta announced, her voice loud enough for others to hear. "I suggest you both prepare to leave the plane." Serafina glanced at Orion, her calm demeanor unshaken. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice soft but carrying a firmness that stopped Araminta mid-stride. Callista shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Araminta and the couple. "Maybe we should check with the captain first. It might help if I've got this," Callista began cautiously. Araminta interrupted sharply, her tone clipped. Callista stepped back, her lips pressing into a thin line, but her eyes lingered on Orion and Serafina with an unspoken apology. Orion pulled his phone back out and checked the screen. 7 minutes, he murmured mostly to himself. Serafina caught his eye, her lips curling into the faintest smile. "Patience," she whispered, her tone steady. Araminta seemed to sense that something was off. Her earlier confidence began to waver, her gaze darting between the couple and the curtain leading to the first-class cabin. "You can record all you want," she snapped, addressing Orion directly. "It doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of," Serafina interjected smoothly. "Even though we've shown you our tickets, which are valid, and we've remained calm and cooperative, you, on the other hand, have escalated this situation unnecessarily. What violation are you referring to exactly?" Araminta's jaw tightened. "It's not about," she began, but she didn't finish. Instead, the phone on the galley wall buzzed, cutting through the tension like a knife. Callista moved instinctively to answer, but Araminta held up a hand to stop her. "I'll get it," she said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. She picked up the receiver, her posture stiff. "This is Araminta," she said, her eyes flickering briefly toward Orion and Serafina as she listened. Whatever was being said on the other end of the line made her expression harden, then falter. "Yes, sir," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "Understood." Araminta hung up the phone and stood motionless for a moment, her back to the couple. Callista took a cautious step forward. "What is it?" she asked softly. Araminta turned around slowly, her face pale. "The captain wants to see me," she muttered, her tone now subdued. Without another word, she brushed past Callista and disappeared through the curtain, leaving the couple standing in the galley. Callista hesitated, then approached Orion and Serafina. "Is there anything I can get you?" she asked quietly, her voice warm but tinged with unease. Serafina gave her a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Callista," she said. "We're fine for now." Callista nodded and stepped back, her unease evident as the moment stretched on. A passenger seated nearby began whispering again, a low murmur of speculation. Orion leaned against the wall, his phone still in hand, while Serafina crossed her arms and looked out the small galley window. Neither spoke, but the faint, knowing glances they exchanged spoke volumes. The clock was ticking, and they both knew it. Araminta walked briskly toward the cockpit, her mind racing as she replayed the phone call. The captain's tone had been firm, leaving no room for argument. When she reached the cockpit door, she took a deep breath before knocking lightly. The door opened and Captain Hawthorne, a seasoned pilot with years of experience, greeted her with a neutral expression. "Step inside," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. Araminta obeyed, stepping into the small space. The co-pilot nodded briefly in acknowledgement before turning back to the controls. The captain gestured for Araminta to take a seat in the jump seat, near the door. "We need to talk about the situation in first class," he began, his tone steady but unmistakably serious. Araminta fidgeted with her hands, trying to maintain her composure. "Captain, I'm handling it," she said quickly. "The passengers in question refused to comply, and I called security to resolve the issue." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. "Refused to comply with what, exactly?" he asked. "I reviewed their tickets myself after the call from headquarters. Both are valid first-class tickets, and I see no reason why they shouldn't be seated where they are." Araminta froze, the weight of his words sinking in. I thought there was a mistake," she stammered. "They didn't seem—" She stopped herself, realizing too late that she had no reasonable explanation for her actions. The captain's expression hardened. "You thought wrong," he said sharply. "We've received a direct call from the executive office regarding this incident. Those passengers are not only within their rights to remain in first class, but one of them, Mrs. Serafia, is well connected to the airline leadership." Araminta's stomach dropped. "Connected to the leadership?" she repeated weakly. The captain nodded. "And she's already reached out to them about what's happened here. They've requested a full report, and they want to know why this situation escalated to this point. You should also know they've instructed me to prioritize the comfort and dignity of those passengers for the remainder of this flight." Araminta felt a chill run down her spine. "I didn't know," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "That much is clear," the captain said coldly. "You acted on assumptions rather than facts, and now we're in a situation that could have serious consequences for this airline. You'll return to the cabin and make no further decisions regarding those passengers. Do I make myself clear?" Araminta nodded slowly, her face pale. "Yes, Captain," she said, her voice hollow. The captain dismissed her with a curt gesture, and Araminta left the cockpit in a daze as she made her way back toward the first-class cabin. Her thoughts swirled with panic. She hadn't just misjudged the couple. She had misjudged the entire situation. Her authority, once a shield, now felt like a fragile mask that could crumble at any moment. When she re-entered the first-class section, passengers watched her closely, some exchanging glances as if sensing that something had shifted. Araminta kept her head down, walking straight past the galley without making eye contact with Orion or Serafina. For the first time, her confidence was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence that spoke louder than any words. Back in the galley, Orion glanced at Serafina with a subtle smirk, but neither spoke. The silence between them was filled with unspoken understanding. Callista lingered nearby, pretending to busy herself with the drink cart while keeping a watchful eye on the couple. Her genuine concern was evident, though she didn't dare voice it aloud. Moments later, a soft chime sounded through the cabin, a signal that usually went unnoticed, but this time it seemed to carry weight, a quiet prelude to what was about to unfold. Callista glanced up instinctively as the curtain leading to first class rustled, and Araminta emerged. Her face was pale and drawn. Her usual brisk movements had slowed, and her shoulders were slowly hunched, as if the weight of the captain's words had physically pressed down on her. Araminta stopped just short of the galley, hesitating for a moment before approaching Orion and Serafina. Her expression was tight, a mixture of forced professionalism and lingering discomfort. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she began, her voice lacking its earlier sharpness. "I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience caused earlier. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Serafina met Araminta's gaze steadily, her face unreadable. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge. Araminta flinched slightly, her confidence unraveling further. "Yes," she said quickly, as if rushing to fill the heavy silence. "It appears there was an error on my part. I assure you it won't happen again." Orion tilted his head, watching Araminta carefully. "You've made quite an effort to remove us from our seats over an error," he said. His tone was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it that made Araminta visibly uncomfortable. Serafina leaned back slightly, her arms crossed. "We appreciate your apology," she said simply, though her tone suggested it wasn't nearly enough. "But I hope you understand that this situation has gone far beyond a mere inconvenience." Araminta nodded stiffly. "Of course," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll make sure everything is taken care of for the rest of your flight." Before either Orion or Seraphia could respond, Callista stepped forward, her movements hesitant but purposeful. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked quietly, her voice warm. "Maybe some water or tea?" Seraphia's expression softened slightly as she turned to Callista. "Thank you," she said. "A glass of water would be fine." Callista nodded and quickly retrieved a glass from the drink cart, setting it on the small tray in front of Seraphia. "If there's anything else you need, please let me know," she said, her sincerity evident as she stepped away. Araminta lingered for a moment longer, as if debating whether to say more, but the weight of the couple's calm yet firm responses seemed to hold her in place. Finally, she muttered another apology and retreated toward the first-class section, her steps quicker now, almost as if she were fleeing. Orion and Seraphia exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. They didn't need to say anything. The dynamic had shifted, and it was clear that Araminta was no longer in control of the situation. Orion checked his phone again, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light of the galley. "Any minute now," he said quietly, his voice tinged with anticipation. Serafina nodded, taking a small sip of her water. "Let us sweat," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "She has no idea what's coming next." Araminta hurried back to the first-class section, her mind spinning. She could feel the eyes of passengers following her, their silent judgment cutting through her already fragile composure. In the galley, Orion and Seraphia remained seated, their expressions calm yet unwavering. The tension in the cabin had shifted, and it was no longer in Araminta's favor. As Araminta reached the galley in first class, Percival, the senior flight attendant, approached her. His demeanor was calm, but there was a sharpness in his gaze. "Araminta," he began in a low voice. "The captain just radioed in. We've received another call from the executive office. They're monitoring the situation closely." Araminta's stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Percival folded his arms, his tone growing firmer. "It means they're not happy, Araminta. They've asked for a detailed report of your actions during this flight, and the captain has made it clear there's no room for further mistakes." Araminta's face paled as she leaned against the counter. "I was just doing my job," she muttered defensively. Percival shook his head. "Was it your job to call security on 2 passengers with valid first-class tickets? You've put us all in a very difficult position." Back in the main cabin, Orion and Seraphia sat quietly, their calm composure masking the storm they had set into motion. Seraphia glanced at Orion, her voice low but steady. "Did they respond yet?" Orion checked his phone, then gave a small nod. "They're ready, just waiting on the next move." Serafina leaned back, her confidence unshaken. "Good," she said. "It's time they understand who they're dealing with." At the same time, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The man who had earlier spoken to Orion leaned toward a nearby woman, whispering, "Do you think they'll actually call the police? This is getting ridiculous." The woman shook her head, her expression disapproving. "They shouldn't even be dealing with this. That flight attendant clearly has something against them." The quiet discontent among the passengers began to ripple through the cabin. More and more people were glancing toward the galley, whispering to each other about what they had witnessed. Araminta, now fully aware of the growing tension, tried to ignore the stares as she busied herself with meaningless tasks. Then the phone in the first-class galley buzzed again. Percival picked it up, his expression unreadable as he listened. When he hung up, he turned to Araminta, his tone serious. "It's the captain. He wants to see you again." Araminta froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What now?" she whispered. But Percival only gave her a hard look. "I think you know," he said simply. Araminta hesitated, then walked back toward the cockpit. Her steps were slower this time. Each step felt heavier than the last. The weight of her earlier decisions pressed down on her. Behind her, the whispers of the passengers grew louder, like an unstoppable tide of judgment that she couldn't escape. Araminta reached the cockpit door, her heart pounding in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle, before she finally knocked. The door opened and Captain Hawthorne's expression was even sterner than before. He gestured for her to step inside, his demeanor leaving no room for argument. "Araminta," he began in a sharp and direct tone, "I've just received another call from the executive office. This situation has escalated beyond what I can manage on this flight. Headquarters is now fully involved, and they've issued a direct order." Araminta swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What kind of order?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The captain leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Effective immediately, you are to be removed from this flight. Security will escort you off the plane once we land. Your actions have not only disrupted the passengers, but they've also drawn the attention of our highest leadership. They're demanding accountability, and they've decided to start with you." Araminta's breath caught in her throat. "You can't be serious," she stammered, her voice rising. "I was just following procedure." "Enough," Captain Hawthorne interrupted, his voice cold and firm. "This isn't about procedure. This is about the choices you made, the assumptions you acted on, and the unnecessary chaos you've caused. There's no excuse for what you did, and now the airline is facing consequences because of your behavior." Araminta's face turned pale, her hands trembling. She opened her mouth to argue, but the captain raised a hand to silence her. "This decision is final. Return to the galley and complete your duties until landing. Once we're on the ground, security will handle the rest." Araminta left the cockpit, her legs feeling as though they might give out beneath her. The whispers from the passengers seemed louder now, and every glance in her direction felt like a judgment she couldn't escape. Her mind raced with panic as she tried to process what had just happened. Back in the main cabin, Orion and Seraphia exchanged a quiet glance as they noticed Araminta's return. Though her face was blank, her stiff movements betrayed the turmoil she was feeling. Callista, who had been standing nearby, stepped toward her hesitantly. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Araminta shook her head sharply, not meeting Callista's gaze. "Just focus on your job," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual authority. Callista stepped back, her expression unreadable, and returned to assisting passengers. Meanwhile, Orion checked his phone again and gave a slight nod to Seraphina. "Just landed at HQ," he said under his breath. Seraphina's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good," she replied. "It's time to wrap this up." The tension in the cabin was thick, and the power dynamic had shifted entirely. While Araminta struggled to maintain her composure, Orion and Seraphina remained calm, quietly waiting for the flight to land and the final act to begin. The plane cruised at 300 FFT, but the atmosphere inside felt anything but smooth. The whispers among the passengers had grown louder, and the energy in the cabin was palpable. Callista moved quietly between rows, offering water and snacks, her kindness standing out in stark contrast to Araminta's earlier hostility. Some passengers, sensing the shift in authority, began openly discussing what had happened in the galley. Araminta stood stiffly, pretending to focus on organizing cups and napkins, but her hands trembled with every movement as she replayed the captain's words over and over, the finality of his decision weighing heavily on her chest. Her attempt to exert control over a situation she thought she understood had unraveled completely, and now the consequences were catching up with her faster than she could process. Meanwhile, Orion and Seraphia remained seated, their composure unbroken. Seraphina adjusted the scarf around her neck, her movements deliberate and calm. "Do you think she realizes what's about to happen?" Seraphina asked quietly, not looking at Orion. "She knows something's coming," Orion replied in a low voice, "but I don't think she understands how big this is yet." Seraphina smirked faintly, picking up the glass of water Callista had given her earlier. A few rows away, the man who had spoken to Orion earlier leaned closer to a fellow passenger, shaking his head. "This whole thing's ridiculous," he muttered. "I saw their tickets when they boarded. There was no mistake. That attendant... Well, I think we all know what this is about." The other passenger nodded, their expression grim. "She didn't expect them to belong there," they said softly. "And now she's paying for it." Back in first class, Percival approached Araminta cautiously, his brow furrowed with concern. "You're going to need to hold it together until we land," he said quietly, keeping his tone neutral. "Making a scene now will only make things worse." Araminta bristled but didn't respond. She couldn't bring herself to admit that Percival was right. Every move she made now felt like it was being watched and judged. Not just by the passengers, but by the crew, the captain, and perhaps even the people on the other end of the calls coming from headquarters. In the main cabin, Seraphina's phone buzzed softly on the tray table. She glanced at the screen and gave a small nod to Orion. "They're ready for us when we land," she said, her tone measured. "Everything is in place." Orion smiled faintly, leaning back in his seat. "Good," he said. "Let's make sure this is handled properly." Then, the announcement from the cockpit broke the growing tension in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The passengers stirred, the usual rustling of belongings and seat adjustments filling the air. Callista moved through the cabin efficiently, checking seatbelts and offering friendly smiles. When she reached Orion and Seraphina, she paused, her gaze softening. "Is there anything else I can get for you before we land?" she asked, her voice gentle. Seraphina shook her head, smiling warmly. "Thank you, Callista, you've been wonderful." Callista's cheeks flushed slightly as she nodded. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said before moving on. Araminta, standing just a few steps away in the galley, stiffened at the exchange, the contrast between her own actions and Callista's professionalism becoming more glaring by the moment. As the plane began its descent, the whispers among passengers turned into low murmurs. Everyone had seen the tension between Araminta and the couple, and now they were speculating on how it might resolve. Some were openly frustrated, muttering about how unfairly the situation had been handled. Others were simply curious, wondering what would happen once the plane touched down. Meanwhile, Orion and Seraphia remained silent, their calm presence a stark contrast to the growing unease around them. Seraphia pulled out her phone once more, typing a quick message before slipping it back into her bag. Orion folded his arms across his chest, glancing out the window as the city below came into view. Araminta, on the other hand, couldn't seem to stay still. She shifted from one foot to the other, her hands twitching nervously as she pretended to adjust the drink cart. Percival shot her a glance from the other side of the galley but said nothing. He didn't need to. The look on her face said it all. She was unraveling. When the plane finally touched down with a smooth landing, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the cabin. But for Araminta, the real anxiety was just beginning. As passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts and retrieve their belongings, she felt the weight of what awaited her on the ground. The captain's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in her career, she felt completely powerless. Seraphina remained seated, her movements as calm and deliberate as ever, glanced at Orion. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Now we wait." Orion nodded, his eyes locked on the curtain separating them from first class. "She doesn't know it yet," he replied. "But this flight just changed everything for her." The seatbelt sign blinked off, and the familiar shuffle of passengers gathering their belongings filled the cabin. The usual rush to exit the plane was underway, but the tension lingering in the air kept people moving a bit slower than usual, their curiosity glued to the events of the flight. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others openly craned their necks toward the galley to see how Araminta, now visibly shaken, was handling the aftermath. Orion and Seraphia remained seated, unhurried. They watched calmly as passengers filed past, their composed demeanor and unspoken declaration that they were firmly in control of the situation. Seraphia checked her phone again, the faint light illuminating her face. Leaning toward Orion, she whispered, "They're in position." Meanwhile, unnoticed, Araminta stood near the galley, her face pale and her shoulders tense. Her attempts to blend into the background were failing spectacularly, as her usual air of authority was replaced by nervous fidgeting. Every time a passenger glanced her way, she stiffened, her eyes darting toward the exit, as if she were already calculating her escape. Percival, still observing her with a mix of concern and disapproval, finally stepped closer. "You can't avoid this, Araminta," he said quietly, his tone even but firm. "It's already out of your hands." Araminta shot him a glare, but it lacked conviction. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she muttered in a low, defensive voice. "I was just doing my job." Percival crossed his arms, his expression unimpressed. "This wasn't about your job. You let your assumptions dictate your actions, and now the whole airline is paying for it. You need to own that." Araminta opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when she saw the first uniformed security officer step through the door at the front of the plane. Her breath caught and her heart sank. This was it. Her worst fears were materializing right before her eyes. The officer scanned the cabin briefly before speaking to Captain Hawthorne, who had stepped out to greet them. Their conversation was brief but serious, and it didn't take long for the officer's attention to shift toward Araminta. She froze as their gaze landed on her, and her attempt to act natural only made her discomfort more obvious. Passengers began to take notice. Their movements slowed as they realized something significant was about to happen. A woman standing in the aisle whispered to the man behind her, "Do you think it's about what happened earlier?" He nodded, his expression grim. "It has to be. Look at her. She's practically shaking." Meanwhile, Callista approached Orion and Seraphina with a soft smile, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "We're almost ready to deplane," she said kindly. "I just wanted to thank you both for staying so calm during all of this." Seraphina returned the smile, her tone genuine. "You've been wonderful, Callista. Be sure to mention that when we speak with your leadership." Callista's cheeks flushed slightly as she nodded gratefully. "Thank you," she said. Then she glanced toward Araminta and hesitated. "I just hope everything works out the way it should." "It will," Orion replied steadily. "It's already in motion." As the last of the passengers exited the cabin, the security officer moved toward Araminta, flanked by another uniformed figure. Araminta stiffened her back, pressing herself against the galley counter as they approached Captain Hawthorne's presence behind them, which added an air of finality to the scene. Percival stepped aside, his face unreadable, as the officer stopped in front of Araminta. "Are you Araminta?" the officer asked, his tone calm but authoritative. Araminta nodded slowly, her voice failing her for a moment before she managed to croak out, "Yes, that's me." "We've been instructed to escort you off the plane for questioning," the officer said firmly. "Please gather your belongings." Passengers lingering near the exit turned to watch, their curiosity barely concealed. Araminta's face burned with humiliation as she fumbled to grab her things. "This isn't necessary," she muttered, her voice shaking. "I was just following procedure." The officer didn't respond, simply stepping aside to allow her to move. The captain's expression remained stern, his silence a clear signal that he supported the decision. Araminta hesitated, glancing toward Percival, but he simply shook his head and looked away. There would be no help from him as Araminta was escorted down the aisle. Orion and Serafina stood, their movements graceful and deliberate. They gathered their belongings without a word, stepping aside to let Araminta pass as she walked by. Serafina's gaze met Araminta's briefly. There was no anger or malice in her eyes, only a calm, unflinching resolve that made Araminta avert her gaze. When Araminta finally stepped off the plane, escorted by the officers, the cabin felt lighter, as though the tension had been physically removed along with her. Callista exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing as she turned back to Orion and Serafina. "Thank you both, again," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "But sincerely," Serafina smiled warmly, her composure unwavering. "You did your job with integrity, Callista. That's all anyone can ask for." Callista nodded, her eyes glistening slightly before stepping away to assist the remaining crew with final checks. Orion and Serafina moved toward the exit, their steps kept steady as they prepared to leave. Outside the plane, Araminta stood near the security team, her posture stiff and defensive. She glanced toward Orion and Serafina as they exited, but quickly looked away, unable to face them directly as they walked past. "Serafina," Orion said in a low voice, "I think she understands now." Serafina nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe," she replied, "but this isn't just about her. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Orion and Serafina stepped into the bustling terminal, the hum of activity around them contrasting sharply with the tented stillness they had left behind on the plane. They moved purposefully, every step a quiet declaration of control and dignity. Behind them, Araminta lingered near the gate, flanked by two security officers. Her face was pale, her movements stiff as she answered their questions in low, nervous tones. The sight of her hunched shoulders and downcast eyes drew the attention of passers-by, many of whom slowed their steps, curious about what had transpired. Serafina adjusted her scarf as she walked, glancing briefly over her shoulder at Araminta. "She's rattled," she said softly, her tone even. "It's hitting her now," Orion nodded, his expression calm but firm. "Good. It needed to be. But this isn't over yet." As they approached the baggage claim, a young woman in a crisp suit stepped forward to meet them. Her polished appearance and purposeful stride identified her immediately as someone of importance. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter," she greeted them with a respectful nod. "My name is Eulalia. I'm with the executive team at the airline. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Serafina extended a hand, her grip firm. "Thank you for responding so quickly," she said, her voice professional but unmistakably resolute. "We have a lot to discuss." Eulalie gestured toward a quiet seating area near the corner of the terminal. "If you'll follow me," she added. "We've arranged a space where we can talk. We've also escalated the situation to our board of directors, as you requested." Orion and Serafina exchanged a brief glance before following Eulalia. The small meeting space was discreet but comfortable, with a sleek table and a set of plush chairs. Serafina set her bag down beside her as they took their seats. Eulalia sat across from them, her notebook and tablet neatly arranged in front of her. "First," Eulalia began, her tone earnest, "I want to personally apologize for the way you were treated. What happened on that flight was unacceptable, and we take full responsibility for the actions of our staff." Serafina nodded but didn't smile. "Apologies are a start," she said evenly, "but they don't do what happened, and they don't address the bigger issue." This wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of a larger problem within your organization. Orion leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. We've encountered this kind of behavior before, but what happened today was particularly egregious. Araminta wasn't just rude or dismissive. She actively escalated a situation that didn't exist. That speaks to a lack of proper training and oversight. Eulalia's face tightened slightly, but she nodded. You're absolutely right, she said, and that's why we've already begun taking action. The employee in question has been suspended pending a full investigation, and we're implementing immediate changes to our training programs to address unconscious bias and customer service protocols. Serafina raised an eyebrow, her tone skeptical. Immediate changes are often reactive. What are you planning to do to ensure this kind of behavior isn't ingrained in your company culture? Eulalia paused, her gaze steady. We're not just focusing on training, she said. We're also revising our internal reporting structures and accountability measures. Every complaint will be escalated to a central review team to ensure transparency and consistency in how these matters are handled. Serafina's lips pressed into a thin line as she considered this. That's a step in the right direction, she said finally, but I want to see measurable results. I want timelines, regular updates, and proof that these changes are being implemented effectively. Words alone won't fix this. Eulalia nodded again, her respect for Serafina evident. Of course, we'll provide you with a detailed plan and ensure you're kept informed at every stage. As Eulalia spoke, Orion's phone buzzed quietly on the table. He glanced at the screen and gave a slight nod to Serafina. It's done, he said simply. Serafina allowed a faint smile to cross her lips. Good, she replied, turning back to Eulalia. Her tone softened slightly, though it remained firm. We're not here to punish your airline unnecessarily. What we want is accountability and systemic change, not just for us, but for every passenger who comes after us. Eulalia exhaled a small note of relief in her expression. I understand, she said, and we're committed to making that happen. The meeting concluded shortly after, with Eulalia promising to follow up within the week. As Orion and Serafina walked back toward the exit, the energy in the terminal seemed to shift. A few passengers who had witnessed the earlier events on the plane approached them, offering quiet words of support. One man, the same passenger who had spoken to Orion during the flight, stepped forward with a nod. I just wanted to say you handled yourself with incredible grace up there. What happened to you was wrong, but you showed everyone how to stand tall. Serafina smiled warmly. Thank you, she said. We just hope this leads to something better. As they left the terminal, the events of the flight began to feel like a closed chapter, but Serafina knew the story was far from over. What had started as a moment of humiliation and prejudice had transformed into an opportunity for change, a change they intended to see through to the end. The drive away from the airport was quiet, but the silence between Orion and Serafina wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective, weighted with the impact of the day's events. The sleek black sedan moved steadily through the city streets, its polished interior shielding them from the chaos outside. Serafina sat upright, her phone in hand as she scrolled through messages and updates from the airline's executives. Each notification was another step forward, another confirmation that their voices were being heard, yet her expression remained measured, her mind calculating. Orion glanced over at her, his tone soft but curious. What's next? He asked. They've taken the first steps, but do you think it's enough? Serafina tilted her head slightly, her fingers pausing over her phone. It's a start, she said thoughtfully. But what happened today wasn't just about one flight or one person. It's about the culture that allowed Araminta to feel empowered to act the way she did. That That's the real fight. Orion nodded, leaning back against the leather seat. You think they'll follow through? Well, they have to, Serafina replied firmly. If they don't, this won't stay contained to just us. We've already set things in motion. As the car pulled up to their home, a sleek, modern townhouse with tall glass windows and clean lines. Serafina's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her lips curving into a faint smile. They are already working on the public statement, she said, showing Orion the message. They're nervous, Orion chuckled softly. They should be. They've seen what happens when you're underestimated. Serafina smirked, but didn't respond. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the entrance. Orion followed, carrying their bags with a practiced ease. Inside, the calm and elegant space welcomed them, a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. Serafina placed her bag on the kitchen counter and exhaled deeply. I'll admit, she said, pouring herself a glass of water. There was a moment up there when I wasn't sure how far this would go. But once Araminta called security, I knew we had her. Orion nodded as he set their suitcases near the stairs. She never expected us to fight back, he said. She thought she had all the power. That's the problem, Serafina replied, her tone sharp but controlled. People like her are so used to their authority going unchecked. They never expect consequences. Orion leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. Do you think she understands now? Serafina took a sip of her water, her expression thoughtful. She might, she said after a moment. But understanding isn't enough. She has to feel the weight of what she did, not just today, but in the long term. And more importantly, the system has to change so no one else gets treated the way we were. Orion smiled faintly. You're not letting this go anytime soon, are you? Not a chance, Serafina replied, her voice resolute. This isn't just about us. It's about setting a precedent. Meanwhile, back at the airline's headquarters, Araminta sat alone in a small, stark conference room. The walls were bare, and the only sound was the faint hum of an air conditioning vent above her. The chair beneath her felt stiff and unyielding, much like the situation she now found herself in. The disciplinary hearing had concluded hours ago, and Araminta was left waiting for the formal notification of the airline's decision. Her mind raced as she replayed the events of the flight. Every glance from a passenger, every murmur in the aisle, and every word spoken by Orion and Serafina played back like a loop. She couldn't escape the realization that she had lost control of the situation, not just in the moment, but entirely. She had thought she could assert her authority and the couple would comply without question. She had been wrong. The door opened suddenly, startling Araminta from her thoughts. A man in a gray suit entered, carrying a thin folder. His expression was professional but cold, and he wasted no time with pleasantries. Mortimer, he began, taking a seat across from her. The board has reached its decision. Araminta sat up straighter, her palms damp as she clasped them tightly in her lap, and she asked, though she already knew the answer. The man opened the folder and glanced down at the document inside. Effective immediately, your employment with the airline is terminated, he said evenly. Your actions during Flight 287 violated company policy and exposed the airline to significant reputational and legal risks. The board has determined that this situation warrants dismissal. Araminta's chest tightened as the words hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to protest, but the man continued before she could speak. You will receive a formal letter outlining the reasons for your termination, along with instructions for returning your uniform and other company property. Security will escort you out of the building. Araminta stared at him, her face pale. I made a mistake, she said weakly. I didn't mean for this to happen. Mistakes have consequences, the man replied bluntly, closing the folder and standing. You'll have an opportunity to appeal the decision if you choose. But given the evidence in the board's stance, I wouldn't expect a reversal. As he left the room, Araminta slumped back in her chair, the reality of her situation crashing down around her. She had underestimated Orion and Serafina, and now she was paying the price. Her career, once a source of pride and authority, had unraveled entirely, and as she sat in that empty room, she realized that there was no one to blame but herself. The ripple effects of Flight 2887 extended far beyond the airplane, or even the airline's boardroom. By the time Orion and Serafina had settled back into the routine of their lives, the incident had already become a topic of national conversation. Social media buzzed with hashtags, and videos recorded by passengers began to surface. Clips of Araminta confronting the couple, Orion calmly filming her, and Serafina's composed responses were shared thousands of times. Discussions about unconscious bias and the power dynamics in customer service industries dominated online spaces, drawing in voices from across the spectrum. For Orion and Serafina, the attention was both validating and exhausting. They hadn't sought the spotlight, but they recognized the power it gave them to push for change. Sitting at their dining table one evening, Serafina reviewed an email from the airline's legal team while Orion scrolled through news articles on his tablet. "They're already rolling out the training programs," Serafina said, tapping a line in the email. "Mandatory sessions for all employees by next quarter. They're also establishing an independent committee to oversee customer complaints." Orion glanced up, nodding. "That's progress," he said. "But is it enough?" Serafina leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start," she said, "but policies and training only go so far. It's the culture that needs to change. People like Araminta need to understand that bias, conscious or not, has real consequences." Orion set down his tablet and folded his hands in front of him. "Do you think she's learned that?" he asked. Serafina considered the question for a moment before answering. "I think she's feeling the consequences, but whether she's learned anything depends on what she does next." Elsewhere, Araminta sat in the dim light of her small apartment, the weight of her termination pressing heavily on her. The letter from the airline lay open on the coffee table, its clinical language detailing the reasons for her dismissal. Beside it, her phone buzzed intermittently with messages from former colleagues. Most were short and curt, expressing disbelief or awkward condolences. Others were harsher, condemning her actions and blaming her for tarnishing the airline's reputation. Araminta hadn't replied to any of them. Instead, she stared at the screen, scrolling through news stories and comment sections that dissected her actions on the flight. The headlines were brutal. Flight attendant fired after calling security on black couple with valid tickets. And bias in the skies, how one airline faced a reckoning. Her name wasn't mentioned directly in most articles, but it didn't need to be. Anyone who had been on the flight or seen the videos knew who she was. And the comments, those were the worst. Strangers speculated about her motivations, her character, even her personal life. She felt exposed, her mistakes laid bare for the world to judge. For the first time in days, Araminta allowed herself to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She had acted on an assumption, plain and simple. She hadn't questioned why she felt the couple didn't belong in first class. She had simply acted, believing her position would shield her from scrutiny. It hadn't. Instead, it had amplified her error, making it impossible to ignore. With a deep breath, Araminta opened her laptop. For hours, she researched articles and watched videos about unconscious bias and diversity training and systemic discrimination. At first, it felt performative, as though she were trying to absolve herself by consuming information. But as she read and listened, something shifted. She began to see herself not just as someone who had made a mistake, but as part of a larger problem, a system that rewarded power imbalances and allowed unchecked authority to flourish. Finally, she opened a blank email addressed to the airline's board. Araminta began to type. Her words came slowly at first, but they gained momentum as she poured her thoughts onto the screen. To whom it may concern, I am writing to formally acknowledge my actions on Flight 287 and to offer a sincere apology, not just to Mr. and Mrs. Carter, but to the passengers, crew, and leadership of the airline as well. My behavior was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the harm I caused. While my termination was justified, I hope to use this experience to grow and contribute to preventing similar incidents in the future. The email was long, reflective, and raw. Araminta didn't shy away from her mistakes, nor did she try to shift the blame. Instead, she outlined specific steps she planned to take to educate herself and make amends. When she finally hit send, it felt like a small weight had lifted. Not enough to erase the consequences, but enough to take the first step toward accountability. Meanwhile, back at the airline's headquarters, Serafina's influence was reshaping policies and priorities. The board had not only implemented her suggested changes, but had also invited her to participate in a panel discussion on corporate accountability and customer relations. Initially hesitant, Serafina agreed, recognizing the opportunity to amplify the message beyond her own experience. The panel took place at a prominent industry conference, with Serafina seated alongside CEOs and diversity experts. Her calm but powerful delivery captured the room. The problem isn't just individual bias, she said during her opening remarks. It's the systems that allow bias to operate unchecked. If we want real change, we have to address both. Her words sparked applause, but more importantly, they sparked conversations that continued long after the panel ended. Attendees approached her, asking for advice and offering support for her efforts. For Serafina, it wasn't about personal recognition. It was about ensuring no one else would have to endure what she and Orion had experienced. Later that evening, as she and Orion shared a quiet dinner at home, Serafina reflected on the journey. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked. Orion smiled softly, reaching for her hand. "We've done what we could," he said. "The rest is up to them. But I think we've started something important." Serafina nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "It's not the end," she said. "It's just the beginning." And she was right. Beyond their dining table, conversations continued in boardrooms, training sessions, and communities around the world. The story of Flight 287 wasn't just about one couple or one flight. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that accountability wasn't just a buzzword, but a responsibility. For Serafina and Orion, that was a legacy worth building. Weeks turned into months, but the ripples of Flight 287 didn't fade. The story continued to resonate, becoming a touchpoint in larger discussions about fairness, accountability, and the biases ingrained in everyday interactions. Media outlets revisited the incident periodically, citing it as an example of how an individual act could expose systemic issues. While Orion and Serafina had largely returned to their normal lives, they found themselves at the center of a movement they hadn't anticipated, but willingly embraced. For Serafina, the work was far from over. She had taken on a formal consulting role with the airline, working directly with their leadership to design and implement comprehensive training programs. These programs didn't just focus on bias, they tackled issues of authority decision-making and the importance of clear, fair policies. Serafina's calm yet firm demeanor earned her respect among the executives, many of whom were initially resistant to the depth of change she proposed. One afternoon, during a presentation to the board, Serafina stood before a screen displaying the airline's new guidelines. Her voice was steady as she explained, "These measures aren't just about preventing incidents like what happened on Flight 287. They're about creating a culture where all employees feel empowered to act with fairness and integrity. That's how you protect your passengers and your brand." The board members nodded, visibly engaged. Even the more skeptical among them seemed to recognize the value in her approach. When the meeting ended, Several executives approached Serafina to thank her personally. One of them, an older man who had been silent throughout most of the session, said quietly, "We've needed this for a long time. I'm just sorry it took what happened to you to bring it to light." Serafina smiled politely, though her eyes carried a quiet determination. "What matters is that it's happening now," she replied. "But it's up to all of you to make sure it lasts." Meanwhile, Orion channeled his energy into documenting their experience. A skilled writer and communicator, he began penning a series of articles and op-eds for prominent publications. In his pieces, he wrote not only about what had happened, but about the larger lessons it revealed. He highlighted the quiet, yet systemic ways in which assumptions could shape actions, often with devastating consequences. His articles sparked widespread discussion, with readers sharing their own stories of bias and injustice in workplaces, schools, and public spaces. One evening, as Orion and Serafia sat in their living room, Orion closed his laptop with a satisfied smile. "The latest piece went live today," he said, turning to Serafina. "It's already getting traction." Serafina glanced up from her notebook, where she had been jotting down ideas for her next project. "What's the angle this time?" she asked. "It's about the power of staying calm under pressure," Orion replied. "How our reaction to that situation shaped the outcome, not just for us, but for everyone watching. People underestimate how much control they have in those moments." Serafina nodded thoughtfully. "It's true," she said, "but it's also exhausting. Staying calm while someone questions your right to be where you belong. It takes more strength than people realize." Orion reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "And you handled it better than anyone could have," he said. "But you shouldn't have had to." Serafina gave him a small smile, her eyes softening. "That's why we keep pushing, so no one else has to." Across the city, Araminta was beginning to rebuild her life, though the process was anything but easy. Her termination from the airline had been a public spectacle, and finding new employment had proven difficult. Many potential employers hesitated after learning about the incident, unwilling to take a chance on someone whose actions had sparked such controversy. Still, Araminta persisted. She had begun attending workshops on bias and discrimination, not out of obligation, but out of a growing desire to understand what had gone so wrong. She met people who shared their own experiences, people who had been marginalized, misjudged, or dismissed because of how they looked or where they came from. Hearing their stories forced Araminta to confront uncomfortable truths about herself, truths she had ignored for far too long. One day, Araminta sat in a small classroom, surrounded by others attending a seminar on unconscious bias. The facilitator, a sharp and compassionate woman, posed a question to the group. "What is one assumption you've made about someone that you wish you could take back?" The room fell silent, the question hanging heavily in the air. Araminta hesitated, her palms sweating slightly. Then, for the first time in a long while, she spoke up. "I assumed someone didn't belong," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "not because of anything they did, but because of how I saw them, and it cost me everything." The facilitator nodded, her expression thoughtful, acknowledging, "It is the first step." She continued, "The next is using that awareness to do better." Araminta took those words to heart. Over time, she began volunteering with organizations that focused on equity and inclusion, sharing her story as a cautionary tale. Though the path was difficult, it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She realized that while she couldn't undo her past actions, she could work to ensure they weren't repeated by others. Back at the airline, the changes Serafina had championed were beginning to take root. Reports of bias complaints had decreased, and employees spoke positively about the new training programs. Callista, the flight attendant who had shown kindness to Orion and Serafina during the flight, had been promoted to a senior role. In her new position, she worked directly with Serafina on implementing crew training sessions, ensuring that empathy and fairness were at the core of every interaction. On a cool autumn evening, Orion and Serafina found themselves boarding another flight, this time for a well-deserved vacation. As they settled into their first-class seats, Serafina glanced at Orion, a faint smile on her lips. "Feels different this time, doesn't it?" she asked. Orion nodded, looking around the cabin. The crew moved with efficiency and professionalism, their interactions with passengers warm and genuine. "It does," he said. "Like things are starting to change." As the plane took off, Serafina leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The hum of the engines filled the air, steady and reassuring. She thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the fight, the progress, and felt a quiet sense of pride. Their journey had been far from easy, but it had been worth it. And as the plane climbed higher into the sky, Serafina knew one thing for certain. The work wasn't over, but they had already made a difference. That was enough for now. This story teaches us that accountability, empathy, and a commitment to systemic change are essential for overcoming ingrained biases and unjust practices. It illustrates how the misuse of authority, fueled by unfounded assumptions, can not only harm individuals, but also undermine the integrity and reputation of entire organizations. The events that unfolded, beginning with a misunderstanding and escalating into a public spectacle, underscored the destructive impact of prejudice and the critical need for calm, dignified responses in moments of conflict. The composed reaction of the affected couple, in stark contrast to the impulsive behavior of the flight attendant, ultimately exposed deep-rooted flaws in a system that allowed unchecked power to persist. By demanding accountability and advocating for improved training and transparent policies, the protagonists sparked a broader conversation about fairness and cultural reform. Their actions demonstrate that while personal mistakes are inevitable, the path to redemption lies in acknowledging those errors and taking deliberate steps to foster a more just and respectful environment for all. This narrative reminds us that meaningful, lasting change is achieved when individuals and institutions work together to correct systemic imbalances. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.